Well, hello and good afternoon. My name is Adam Roberts. I'm the Midwest correspondent for The Economist. And in the interest of public health and in accordance with the CDC's guidelines, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs has made the decision to cancel all of its in-person public events until at least June the 5th. So we're delighted that you're able to join us instead via Zoom today. The Council is independent, non-partisan, and all the views expressed by myself and by our guest today, Diane Swonk, are our own. They don't represent any institutional positions or the views of the Council. So for the topic today, it's the obvious one. The coronavirus pandemic is accelerating around the world. All over the world, economies are facing all sorts of problems. It's roiled markets, the effect on supply chains are profound. There's so much uncertainty in how this is going to play out in our national economies and in the global economy. We've seen the spike in unemployment levels in the US at the most extreme level that any of us, I think, will have any memory of. We've seen the passage of a $2 trillion act to try to deal with some of the effects of this. And at the same time, we're going to have to see how this plays out while we're trying to tackle one of the worst public health crises that the world has ever seen. So in the face of this pandemic, how are we going to cope and what will be the effect on the economy? Well, I'm delighted to say that we've got Diane Swonk to help us unpack this and think through what this will mean. Diane is the chief economist and managing director at Grant Thornton. She's a macroeconomist with more than 30 years experience in the financial sector and with a special interest in economics of the labor market and in monetary policy. Diane also advises the Federal Reserve's Board of Governors, regional Federal Reserve banks, all levels of government, and I'm going to stop there because there's just so much more I could say. Thank you to Diane for being here today. Just to explain how this is going to work, we've got about 40 minutes to chat via Zoom. For about 20 minutes, I'll be chatting directly to Diane, and then I want to take in questions from the floor. And obviously, we're going to use technology to do this, so please go to ccga.live if you'd like to submit a question, or even if you don't want to submit one, if you'd like to vote on which questions you want me to put to Diane. And I will take those questions mostly towards the end of the session, but if there's a fantastic one that appears in the early session too, I'll take it then. So we've got a little bit of time to get going. Diane, thank you for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So I think the most useful thing we can do is just try to set the scene for now. We've seen some terrible jobs numbers in the last 2 weeks, and especially the last day or so. We've now seen about 10 million people who've lost their jobs. Where do you think we are in terms of the state of the US economy in particular?
Well, we're in the deepest recession we've seen since 1946, when millions of soldiers returned from World War II, and the contraction in growth in the second quarter is at least about 30%. We are expecting to see not only the millions in unemployment claims that we saw, about 10 million in the last 2 weeks, that understates the actual number of people who lost their jobs, and the ones that are currently qualified to now apply for unemployment insurance but still can't get through the state websites, and the furloughed workers, the gig workers, the self-employed, and also there's been seizure of these state websites because they never were designed to hit this kind of volume. To give you a sense of the perspective here, not only was the job losses in the month of March, which was early in the month before we saw these shelter-in-place orders, stay-at-home orders, the 701,000 was the largest increase drop we've ever seen in employment at the start of a recession. And I've never known in my entire career the exact week a recession began and the economy collapsed, which was March 1st, 2020.
I mean, there's a strange feeling. I don't know if you step out of your house for a walk to do a bit of exercise or something, you can walk around the streets, and in some senses you don't feel that anything's changed. You don't necessarily feel it in the air, and yet so many people, as you say, have lost their jobs. How do we think about this? How do we try to imagine what's coming down the road? Do we think of this as more like a sort of natural disaster that has hit the economy, some hurricane like Hurricane Katrina that has just blown in and done some terrible damage that we might actually be able to recover from fairly quickly, a sort of V-shaped recession that we're going to get through and bounce back from? Or do we begin to think that this is something that will have very long-term effects?
I actually think it's more longer term, and the idea of a V-shaped recovery is more a fantasy. I think the natural disaster is an interesting way to think about how regional economies are shocked, but this is more like a meteorite hitting the planet and knocking it off its orbit, and we've got to get it back into its orbit. And the world we return to will be similar, but not the same as the one we left. So not only is there this extraordinary period and the cost benefit on whether or not you try to stem the virus, and I know we're going to talk later about countries that maybe are not as much on board on that, but the trade-off for the economy is sort of unambiguous. We know from 1914 flu pandemic, the cities that actually did this recovered better. The damages to cities that didn't had much more lingering long-term effects. And I think it's very important to understand that. But when we ramp up, we don't just turn on a spigot again. This is an economy put in a deep freeze to contain the spread of a virus, but it thaws extremely slowly and unevenly. And that's global and across the country. And, interestingly, you're going to see some states move forward first to start to unwind this and do it in a very methodical, without a vaccine. You have to have, protocols to sanitize workplaces, public spaces. You got to have masks. You got to have tests, proliferated, test to tell whether or not you have the virus, test to tell whether or not you have antibodies. All of this needs to come to place for triggers to ramp up very slowly. And we've already seen countries that tried to move a little more quickly that had seemed to contain the virus are suffering a second wave of infections. And that would, the behavioral effects of that are quite devastating.
Yeah, I saw today that Singapore, which was cited as one part of the world that had done a very good job of tackling the public health side of this and was seeming to stay open for business and able to keep its economy ticking over, has just today announced that it will go into another month of lockdown. So we're beginning to see that even those places we could be hopeful about, we have to have some worries.
Exactly. And I think, people get sort of ahead of themselves, and it really is, you have to move in phases. And there are some models out there, people who are advising the administration. Dr. Gottlieb is one of them that we've seen out doing a lot of work on this. And, they're talking about triggers and needed triggers to keep people safe in order to move very cautiously, methodically. And, as you open one region, you don't necessarily say New York press first and they begin to open. No one's going to rush to New York overnight, which is good because you don't want to get the cross-contamination again, but you need to have sort of a slowdown in mobility dramatically.
Well, before we look ahead to how we recover from this, maybe we can look at the responses so far to the first sort of shockwave of what's just hit us. The most obvious one is the CARES Act and the government, Congress and the government together, the effort to put $2 trillion into the economy. What's your reading of that? Do you think it's sufficient? Do you think it's well structured? How do you think that is going to have an impact on the US economy?
Well, it's not sufficient, first of all, but let's go back. And, since March 3rd, we've seen 3 phases plus a national disaster declaration, which freed up some $50 billion in additional funds. So it's over close to $2.5 trillion now, just since March 3rd, bipartisan movement in trying to get aid into the water. I sort of look at the COVID-19 as the iceberg. We don't have to be the Titanic if we can get lifeboats in the water to traverse these COVID-tainted waters. And the effort has been to get the light water. That said, we try to move quickly and it's been at a breakneck pace, but we're chasing a moving target. So 1, it's not enough. 2, we're finding bureaucracy is an issue. The Small Business Administration, also like the state and local governments and the state unemployment insurance claims, were not set up to handle the volume of what's coming in. Banks were not ready for this in a week's time to ramp up lending, and they're worried about taking on the liabilities of small businesses that don't meet all the qualifications of a grant, which is Small Business Administration is changing from what Congress intended. So there's a lot of complications. That's bound to be expected as we try to move so quickly, and we're going to need more and faster for small businesses in particular and states. I want to get into those 2 in particular because the hole for states is so large, and they're at the front line of the crisis battling this. And if we don't have transfers for the states, this is what we know from the Great Recession, that the states, they had this other leg down that was the primary reason employment did not recover, and we had a subpar recovery in employment, was because the states were cutting back as the rest of the economy is ramping up. The same thing could happen with this in a much more immediate phase. By the third quarter, we could see massive draconian cuts at the state and local level if we do not see transfers to the state to block the whole, not only the costs of COVID, but the loss in revenues, which are quite significant.
I'd like to take you back to something you said before we came on air, where we were talking about how it felt back in 2008, 2009, just on that sense of how quickly it's happened this time. If you recall back to how you were thinking about the crisis more than 10 years ago, how would you compare the two? What's the significant difference between the Great Recession and now?
Well, there's two things that really stand out. I mean, during the Great Recession and the crisis of September 2008, and I sort of have an idiot savant memory of everything that happened in that period of time by the day. It felt like standing on a fault line, trying to find your grounding, and you're on a fault line and things are shifting. This is quicksand. The difference is so much more rapid and so much more persistent, and the magnitude of the losses are so much larger. I mean, to think of, we're going to have the payroll employment, which was 701,000 losses this month. The increase in the unemployment rate, if we look at just, the unemployment claims since the payroll report survey was taken, it looks like the unemployment rate's going up at a pace of about 0.5% a week. Over the course of the expansion, we saw the unemployment rate fall at about 0.5% a year.
Wow.
It's just stunning to see where we're at right now. And the actual today, participation rate plummeted. Also, people in the labor force plummeted. We also saw that people didn't answer the questions quite right when they said they were absent from work. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics actually wrote a special write-up of this right on the front page of the report and said, actually, the unemployment rate wasn't 4.4% as of March 12th. It was 5.4%. The U6 unemployment rate, which includes a record number of workers that were pushed from full-time employment into less hours, part-time, and likely then lost by the end of the month, that was the largest increase we've ever seen in a 1 month in that number. 1.3 million workers forced into part-time from full-time employment. And, these are tells about what is to come, but it really is quite stunning how rapidly things are deteriorating. And so there was that fault line sense. This is quicksand. On the flip side, what's important to remember too, and I don't give short answers, sorry, Adam.
Okay, good answers, that's what matters.
But the other part is, what we didn't know in 2008 and 2009 was there an end date? And could we stop the crisis from metastasizing into a financial crisis? We couldn't. This is a health crisis that has metastasized into a financial crisis, and we're trying to stem that. The Federal Reserve, the federal government, central banks around the world, governments around the world, working in sync, not necessarily coordinated, but working in sync. That's really important because we know that the virus has an end date. So we know that it will crest. We know that we can do things to mitigate it and to ramp up in a way that we couldn't. So as much as I don't think this is a V-shaped recovery, I think it's going to take at least 2 years to get back to the previous level of economic activity that we've lost. And it will take even longer to get to lower rates of unemployment. Yeah. But it isn't the Great Recession, and it gives us an opportunity to not only put the lifeboats in the water, but plan on what we should put in place when we need the stimulus to have an economy to stimulate to recover.
And on the efforts that have been made so far, I mean, you talk there about the jobless numbers and the effect on workers. So we're not just talking about bailing out banks that were in trouble last time around, not just talking about corporate bailouts, but directing help towards individual workers in a way that I don't think we've seen in America before. The efforts to help those who aren't even formally with an employer can still get some sort of benefit. Right. This does seem a breakthrough in some ways. Are you surprised at the ability of Congress to get this done?
This is what, I got to give credit where credit is due. I mean, as much as, you look back at the Great Recession and the stimulus package was skimpy at the time compared to the hole we had blown in the economy, but they knew they could only get 700 and some billion, not trillions, and they needed more, but they couldn't get more, even with everyone sort of with their oars in the water rowing in the same direction. Yeah. To think of the extraordinary divisions we have in Congress today, And this was able to be done in such a quick period of time, at least is really reassuring that there's an understanding that this time is different.
Yeah.
This is a health crisis. It's metastasizing into an economic crisis. It doesn't have to be another depression. And if we don't do something, it will be. And I think that reality is setting in. And it really is amazing to see the shift. What I said on my Twitter feed at one point in time, because I get all these people from, extremes and they're, we want moral hazard and we want all these checks and balances. And I'm like, put your biases. I've got a warehouse. If it makes anyone feel good, I've got a warehouse of all my biases from everything else we've learned and put them in the warehouse because this is different. This really is different. And we have to hit it on all sides. You have to bail out companies because there won't be jobs to go to if you don't bail out those companies.
Yeah.
And it's not fun. It's not pleasant, but it is the reality we face, and it's better than the alternative.
And in that context, we have a question about the access to credit and the Fed's role in boosting this. A questioner wants to know why this is crucial. Why is it so important at this stage to get the access to credit moving?
Well, it's really interesting is the financial crisis associated with this outside of the banking industry has been more rapid than the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009. And Jay Powell has really moved remarkably. He's had the advice of Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen, and he's got a lot of people with muscle memory of the crisis within the ranks of the Federal Reserve. And they're doing things they didn't do back then because this is different. And they're doing it, they're not only backstopping the credit markets, they're leveraging fiscal policy, working with Congress to actually implement and leverage the loans with collateral at the Treasury. 450 some odd billion in corporate lending will be leveraged up to 4 trillion, buying municipal bonds, and actually also looking at ways that they can get their regional banks to getting money directly into the hands of small businesses and into individuals' hands. This is really important because the Fed is risking an enormous amount of their independence, and they're willing to take that calculated bet because the alternative was too dire. Right. And they understood that. And I think that, people forget credit is the oil of the market machine. Without credit, the whole machine seizes up. We also need bailouts so that you don't have bankruptcies and a self-fulfilling, metastasizing financial crisis. And there still will be parts that the Fed and the government can't help as well.
But again, as you say, that was a measure of how dire the situation is, that they were ready to take that step. I'm sitting in Chicago. I think many people on this call are also here in the Midwest side. I wonder if you have any particular thoughts about how this part of the country is already being affected and how the coming weeks and months might have a particular impact on not just manufacturing, but generally the economy in the Midwest. How should we expect things to play out here?
It's really interesting. I mean, I spent much of my life as a Midwest economist when I started out, and I grew up in Detroit. And so this is, I've been walking plant floors since I was about 2 years old and could walk. So this is something very close to me. First of all, we're a transportation hub. And so that's one of the reasons Chicago is an epicenter, Detroit's an epicenter. We are exposed to all of this because we are international, we are global in scope. And the other issue is that services versus manufacturing. Chicago is a convention hub. And so, I was actually in a hotel lobby as in late February as these big tech conferences were being canceled, and conferences in Chicago were being canceled as well. Yeah. And overheard someone saying to the workers, "We're not going to need you now." And, hearing that on real time and being in Chicago, knowing how big the convention business is to us. So there's a service sector side. The manufacturing side, we're durable manufacturing, not as much non-durable food manufacturing, the essentials. There is some of that in the broader Midwest, but in our immediate Midwest, not as much. But the non-durable manufacturing is the essentials. We need toilet paper, which everybody is buying like crazy. Yeah. Who knew? Yeah. Apparently Italy's even outstripped us in toilet paper hoarding. But I think it outstripped. I'm not sure that went well with that. But anyways,
I did read that the US, average consumer in the US buys 27 kilos of paper tissues every year. So I think that's a record in the world.
It's a lot. Yeah. But yes, the non-durable side of manufacturing, the essential side of it, that will stay up and running, like grocery stores, like pharmacies, like the delivery people, although they have clear risks. They're at the front lines of this, like the healthcare workers in terms of exposure, not as much, but the healthcare workers have it even more because it turns out the magnitude of their exposure to the virus actually matters. Yeah. That's why they're being so sick. But, that part stays open, but the rest of it shuts down. I mean, it was interesting that the UAW was making, requests before we were actually doing the shelter-in-place orders that maybe we need to close plants because we're afraid of getting infected in the plants. And that's something that, I think was a surprise. Also, we were affected sooner than other parts of the country by the supply chain disruptions out of China. And that's something that sort of got lost in translation. So what's been interesting too is the New York Times had a heat map of how people have been moving. I got to say, our part of the Midwest, we have not moved. We are sheltering in place. And I got to give us a lot of credit for that.
Is that North European, Nordic, well-behaved part of the country where people are deciding to listen to the instructions and take it seriously, I think?
I'm not sure they take it as seriously as I'd like, given what I see in some parks out there. And we did have to close down the lakefront, of course, the first sunny day in Chicago when we were sheltering in place because people were playing beach volleyball. That's not social distancing. But, we maybe the fact that it is just colder, we're better at doing it. But we have actually... I'm thinking back on that because my mother's from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So the only other language I know is Canadian, which has a big influence of those Nordic countries in it as well.
True. Now, you mentioned China in your answer just now, and I'd like to sort of step away from the US economy a little and think about how what's happening here is taking place in the midst of the rest of the world going through something almost identical. I know, obviously, I'm British. I know what's happening in Western Europe. We know that even in China, though they claim they're past the worst of it, it could easily be a problem there for months to come. When you look globally, what do you see as the biggest threats coming? Is it disruption to supply chains? Is it the damage that's being done to important trading partners, whether it's in North America or Western Europe or wherever? Where do you see the international element of this being a concern?
I think the global demand and the unevenness with which we ramp up, and then the setbacks. You're seeing setbacks, as you mentioned, in Singapore. China's always also worried about another secondary outbreak, whether it's being imported or not. It doesn't really matter. We can split hairs on why they're going through it. But the bottom line is ramping up without a vaccine is a dangerous thing. And, what's interesting too is the logistics and ramping up, and also seeing China at the early edge of this, feeling the dampening effect of a global economy. Even as their factories get disinfected and people are returning, they can't ramp up because there is no demand. And so the supply chain disruptions it's a supply and a demand shock, but I think the demand shock is more dominant in terms of as we ramp up unevenly, what will that mean? And then you'll start to see supply chain issues as well. But the demand weakness, this is a disinflationary, deflationary global environment. We're in a global recession, and we want to avoid a global depression with deflation.
I mean, this is also taking place at a time when the US doesn't have the best relations it might have had with other countries around the world. And how much is it going to be important that there's a coordinated response, that the largest economies, whether it's through the G7 or some other international mechanism, get together and say, we need to work in tandem on how to solve this thing? Do you believe that there's a chance for that to happen?
Well, we're sort of moving synchronously, and the central banks are certainly talking to each other. We have had G8 or G7 meetings that have been virtual. I wish they were G20. Actually, Christine Lagarde, when she was finance minister of France during the height of the crisis in the fall of 2008, made sure we had a G20 meeting and include the emerging markets as well. And the idea of we're all putting our oars in the water at the same time, much more coordinated responses. Now, it's hard to coordinate, ushering cats of fiscal policy. It's easier to coordinate central banks. This is happening synchronously, but there's clearly a break. When you see things like Russia and Saudi Arabia having a price war over oil prices, targeted in part to push out the shale industry, when we already have weak global demand and oil prices already falling precipitously. That really speaks to Russia and China actually showing up as aid for the rest of the world in a role that the U.S. once played. It gets to the different huge geopolitical shifts we've seen out there, and they're lingering. And I worry that they actually reverse, they compound in the wake of this crisis.
We spoke a little before about trade-offs, and I was particularly intrigued by the experiment that seems to be underway, the natural experiment underway in Sweden right now, which has not closed its economy as forcefully as many democracies and other countries have done. Do you look internationally and look for experience of other countries, maybe Sweden, for example, to try to learn something from their responses and how to track whether that's turning out to be more painful or more beneficial?
Well, that's what we do have to do, is we have to look internationally. I look at Korea, and Korea has done, very well at testing.
Mm-hmm.
And Sweden is interesting because the cultural issues there is, even though they're not under shelter-in-place rules, and they're much more free to do things than we are here at the moment.
Mm.
It's not as if it's the whole herd and let's go out to all the bars and party like crazy. They are actually respecting some of this. So there is a different culture and a different respect. There's also their countries around them, like Norway, are, if you come in from Sweden, you have to be quarantined for 2 weeks once you get there. So this is it's not clear. We'll see what happens with Sweden. It's an interesting, more homogenous economy than our own. This Korea situation also not exactly transferable, but what we're learning across the board is testing reliably, testing for antibodies, testing for the virus, and protective medical gear, protective masks, and things like that are going to be a part of our lives for some time to come. One of the reasons that some of these other countries did well initially was they had experience with SARS or with MERS. And so they, did handle the lockdowns. And then more strategically, the reason Korea is suffering more now is they're strategic about their lockdowns and they're good at identifying it, but they're having to deal with a world that is a mess. And they also have had supply chain disruptions from China, but more importantly, they don't have any demand for their stuff for the rest of the world.
Now, it may be still very early days, but it's interesting to think ahead to what might change after the pandemic. And we have a series of questions on these, but one that I'm particularly interested in is just this broad question of de-globalization, whether one of the consequences of what we've seen, whether it's getting access to ventilators or just masks and gloves and so on, will that spur, do you think, more inclination among politicians and others to say that we need to do more manufacturing at home? We need to have our supply chains within, for example, the United States, rather than rely on supplies coming from China. Do you think we're going to see changes to the world economy because of this pandemic?
I worry that this is an accelerant to deglobalization. And, the irony is that the opposite is that, tariffs on the largest producer of protective medical gear and high-tech medical equipment in the world, China, is one of the reasons we didn't have the supplies we needed. And some of those tariffs were quietly rolled back on March 10th. That's very late. And now they're looking at a 90-day moratorium and holding back on tariffs to be able to get the things we need for ventilators and the components and try to get all this into this country. The irony of thinking the way that we're seeing people think about borders is that if we had closed all our borders, we still have a virus. And if you have something break out, the whole country is still shut down. So it's not like, so if you have production in Texas, it's not like you could easily move it, if that shut down and that stops, you're not going to have your supply chain still. It was stunning to see the French finance minister come out of the G20 meetings and say, listen, I think we should all go regional now. Well, where in Europe can you possibly produce and get what you need from your supply chain right now? It's shut down. It's locked down. So it's kind of it's an extension of what we already know in the G20. 55 new and existing political parties, the overwhelming majority have moved towards what we call nationalism, which is anti-immigration, curbs on refugees, increased tariffs, quotas, and protection of favored industries. That is all, the sort of move we've seen collectively in the wake of the global financial crisis, which now seems like a cakewalk compared to this. And now we have this as another accelerant, not the right answer, but another accelerant in the wrong direction of breaking the world apart when the whole is truly greater than the sum of its parts, when we're sharing data and information and the need to be able to do coordinated efforts. I
think that's absolutely right. It's a message that's worth reasserting again and again, that where we have actually stayed open, we've communicated with each other, we've shared, for example, interesting information about the strand of the DNA of this virus itself, where scientists can cooperate, where we can trade the goods back and forth. Actually, we're much stronger in dealing with this. And where we've hidden behind walls, we're actually much weaker than we need to be.
Exactly. And denial.
Yeah. I want to take some of these questions. One of them, which has the most votes, it sort of picks up on that point we were just making. What things do you believe will never go back to normal post-pandemic? We've talked about deglobalization, but is there anything else that you look at, whether it's in the field of maybe the stimulus plan and the efforts to help workers, or paid sick leave, or if certain industries need to have bailouts and nationalizations? Are there things that you're looking at that you might not expect to return to how it was before the pandemic hit?
Well, of course, before the pandemic, one of the number one issues of voters, no matter what their stripes, no matter what they thought, was healthcare.
Yeah.
And this has laid bare the holes in our system. And here we're a country, the wealthiest in the world, with very little safety nets and very large holes in what safety nets we have. We have unprecedented checks going out to people, but if you have to wait for the check to be printed, it could be printed as late as September. That's not going to feed you. And so, this is really the idea that we're willing to cover the cost of tests, but we're really not. How is that going to work? And if you get hospitalized from COVID, there's money to cover that, but how do you apply for it? How do you go through that bureaucracy? It's certainly politically, there's issues that are going to be front and center for the elections. Also, getting mail-in ballots for the elections is essential, because we're not going to be in a place where people are going to be safe to be clustered in a public place. And it gets to the other accelerants of things we've seen out there, online versus brick and mortar. Public spaces, going out to the movie theaters. These were already places that were threatened prior to this. And this is a natural accelerant, because it's hard. I mean, the thought of going out for, dinner and a movie is something that, is not going to be on the top of my list anymore. And I stream all the time, but, this is going to be an accelerant for online. The idea of, how fast food is working, where, they get the grab and go, and the drive-through deliveries, the deliveries themselves, changing the whole nature of even fast food.
Yeah.
So there is going to be things that linger, because one, we don't have a vaccine that everyone's been vaccinated, and we have to be more safe. But two, the grocery deliveries and things like that. This is all going to change a lot of models that we're already in the process of changing, but it acts as an extraordinary accelerant post-pandemic.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned earlier, and we've had a question that's again had lots of votes. We were talking about the states and how the state finances are going to be threatened by the general downturn. I was reading this morning that in Illinois in particular, there's a forecast that it might be twice as bad in terms of lost revenue compared with the Great Recession. I'm sure Illinois is particularly vulnerable, but there are many, many states that are going to have the same sorts of problems. You mentioned earlier that if there isn't help given to the states, that will dampen any recovery that might come along later. But where do you see the states having a role in the recovery or in the economic bounce back, and how can they be helped most?
Well, transfers to the states are critical to really backfill the loss in revenues, coupled with the costs. They're getting more in terms of the costs for COVID itself and fighting it, but even there, not enough. And so to backfill the loss in revenues, if you don't, the states don't have a lot of flexibility. We've also delayed, every state in the country has delayed tax, day to July from April, which means they've not got revenues coming in. They can temporarily finance some of that, because that makes sense, because it's, they're going to get it at a later date, but even those revenues are compromised by this.
Yeah.
And I think, you have to look at the overall picture and say, what happened? What did we learn from the Great Recession? Because we didn't have transfers to the states in the stimulus that were large direct transfers to the states. As the recovery started to get going, the biggest blow, of course, was to real estate revenues, because the housing market was still in a bust and people were in foreclosure and not paying real estate taxes. That was funding education. The loss in education jobs as the economy was getting going is the opposite of what we usually see, and accounted for much of the shortfall in the jobs recovery from the Great Recession. Now you multiply that times, a lot more in this case of COVID-19, and you get draconian cuts in state and local budgets, which cut into everything from educational to essential services. How often does your garbage get picked up? How many more potholes are we going to have out there? I do think we're going to get an infrastructure bill finally out of this, which we desperately need. But, that's something that gets done later, not now. And the states, if they don't get this money as early as the third quarter, they could be adding insult to injury instead of enhancing a very gradual, sort of methodical ramp up. And I think, that's very important to understand.
Yeah. We've had another question that touches on housing and property, I guess, more generally, which is a lot of people maybe are struggling to pay their rent, whether that's small businesses or even individuals. Landlords will obviously suffer if they're not collecting that rent. What do we expect to see when it comes to the broad property part of the economy, and also then what that might mean for infecting or affecting the rest of the economy?
It's really important. Not only the rental component and mortgage component for small businesses, which, this is a part of the Small Business Administration. There was a glitch and, sort of wants to pull your hair out. Congress did not intend. They wanted to have loans to small businesses that if they brought people back on payrolls, they would be grants and paid back. And then the Small Business Administration said only the part where the payrolls would be paid back would be considered a grant. The rest would be debt, and the banks were afraid they might be liable. So this is one of the glitches in the last couple of days that came up. You need to cover mortgage expenses and rent for small businesses so that they can get to the other side and not burn through all the cash flow and shut down and be gone forever. So that's one aspect of it that we still need to solve. And we're working on fixing those problems, but we're chasing a moving target. On the other side of it, the larger issue of holidays for people, the banks offering holidays for workers affected. Here's my dog. Sorry about that. That's fair. This is sheltering in place. So he's half Saint Bernard, half Beagle with a very baritone howl. So anyways, my daughter brought him home a week before 18th birthday and then left for college. But anyways, I think it's important to understand on the property side of it, you can have forgiveness of mortgages, but then what happens to the mortgage servicers? So every time we fill one hole, we open another. And that's what this is going to be like. It's going to unfold in these waves of issues that we have to solve. And why is it so critical? Housing was on a tear, finally, after 12 years prior to COVID-19. We're finally building and buying. Millennials finally able to buy. This is the sector that if we keep things intact, can lead us out of the recession and serve the role it always has, except for the Great Recession when we had housing bust. And that really is an accelerant to the rest of the economy. So that's why we have to pay attention to what other holes or foundation cracks in our foundation occur. When we fill in one crack, where do we do for the other one? What do we do for mortgage servicers if we're allowing people to not pay their mortgages for a year?
I have a question now that maybe we should think of as a slightly positive question after a lot of discussion that maybe is not much to lift our hearts at the end of the week. The question is, given that the world has managed to come together to tackle, to some extent, the virus and to deal with the response to the virus, should we look at this as reasons to be optimistic about tackling climate change? Is there anything that's happening in the global response to one common threat that may be relevant for how we respond to another common threat that has a longer, less dramatic effect on us?
I actually, what's interesting about climate change, and I feel very strongly about it, the economics it's unambiguous as well. The cost benefit's unambiguous about you stem the virus and you have to do that. Climate change, we have to deal with this. This is a huge economic threat. It is a environmental threat. It's all of the above. And so there's no reason not to deal with it. And what's been interesting to me is how global the response has been among the private sector, even when our governments have dragged their feet. And that is really encouraging to me, is that you've seen large companies already moving ahead and saying, listen, this is where the world is going, period. Yeah. We see it. Even, companies like, we've seen the large airlines saying they want to be carbon neutral. We've seen large oil companies say they want to be, carbon neutral. That is stunning. Yeah. And so I do think that there is a realization, even though we're decoupling and deglobalizing, the infrastructure of globalization, particularly in our financial markets, but the infrastructure is already in place. And so, we're breaking apart something that's very hard to pull apart. And the legacy of that is that there is this sense that, what happens here doesn't just matter here, or what happens abroad can wash up on our own shores and vice versa. And I think that's the silver lining to this, is that there is a realization that we all are part of one planet. It's not as much in our political hemisphere as I would like, but the fact that it's in the private sector and not going away, and it's considered just a part of business, is something that's really encouraging to me.
I'd agree, and I'd say that the two subjects have in common as well, that you have to listen to experts, you have to listen to what the scientists are telling us, and those who are making forecasts and trying to explain how this will be good for us in the long term. If you take these actions early, you'll have a much better influence on the outcome than if you leave it too late. And I think, in a sense, that's a form of education for us to take away from this crisis, relevant not just to climate change, but also for preparing for the next public health crisis, which could come along not in another 100 years, but in another 5 years. So we may as well get some lessons from this as well.
Exactly. And, you pointed out the issue of what we're sharing at the scientific level. I mean, Germany and Norway now are going to participate in this sort of 100,000 random individuals to test and really get a sense of what is the way that this is transmitted through asymptomatic individuals, how, everything we can possibly know. And we have this incredible opportunity to learn so much from this incident. And the reality is, in the post-COVID-19 world, pandemics, as I said before, are a reality. They're not just the plot of a scary horror movie.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that we have to, in climate change, already know it's here. I mean, we're dealing with, how many Category 5 hurricanes? I mean, we're going into hurricane season, and we're not going to be done with COVID-19.
Yeah.
That is something that, we're talking to companies all the time is, are you prepared not only for dealing with COVID-19 and all of the protocols that are going to need if you try to ramp up, and as we try to do that, also a second wave potentially in the fall, if we can contain third and fourth waves over the summer, but then also it's hurricane season, and that's just in the United States.
Yeah. Leading on from that point, one of the questions we've had is about Asian countries and whether they've been better prepared to deal with COVID-19 because of their experiences with SARS, with MERS, with swine flu, and they've been more affected, I think, in the past 20 years by these sorts of epidemics than maybe we have in Western democracies. So they've learned something, whether it's to wear masks or whether it's how the governments respond. So have they been better prepared and better able to respond to this? And perhaps are there things that we should take from them to help our response?
Yes, they have. And I think, one is having the right protective medical equipment around for everyone and making that part of everyday use. If you have a cold, you really shouldn't be getting on the, mass transit without a mask on. If you're sick, you really shouldn't be doing that. And so, sort of things that have been common in Asian cultures are even down to, in my house, we always take the shoes off at the front door. Not everybody does that. That's done in a lot of Asian cultures, but that also does stop from tracking things in the house.
Yeah.
And, these are real issues that we're going to be embracing now, but the speed with which they reacted. Now, China, we can all, have a lot of debate about whether they tried to cover it up, which they did. We know they did. They delayed, and there were consequences to that. But the speed with which, Korea and Singapore, Hong Kong, and even Japan, didn't really like the cruise line not being able to, sort of making it a petri dish. But the idea that you can actually make it less bad and more strategic, I think, is something, because they've dealt with this before and they know the trade-offs.
And linked to that, there's a question about how the global supply chain might be affected, but also, I suppose, how it might change over the years to come, especially from Asia, since they're so important for global supply chains. Do you think that we're going to see shifts and upheaval there in the years to come?
There has been shifts already because of the trade wars. What's been very hard is China is such an extraordinary integrated infrastructure, and it's not easy to you can't just move it all unless you're a very, very large company to Vietnam and build, actual housing for workers to live in and all of that. So it's not as if it's easy to move around. That said, the NAFTA region or the USMCA, which is yet to be ratified, that would, could benefit. Mexico is the largest beneficiary of the trade war with China, even though they've suffered a recession with low oil prices and the trade war, the knockoff effects on manufacturing. But, as a long-term play, they all of a sudden look better. That said, I do see these shifts coming, but what do they really protect us from? What if you get a hurricane, that knocks out your production in a lower cost part of the country, and all of a sudden you don't have the supply from that? So I really think, this is a bit of, it's a false narrative that you sort of just bring everything home and that makes it safe, because clearly in a world with climate change and pandemics, among a lot of other fat tail risks that it's not just one black swan. What is it? It's a gaggle of geese. I'm not sure what swans are called, but it's a large group of them, and they're all coming at once, and that means we have to allocate so many resources to things hedging risk instead of building the future. And that's something I also worry about, because we're undermining potential growth. We've already had a dearth of investment as well, and that's an issue that also feeds through all this. Is there's nowhere to hide, and to pretend like you can put your head in a hole is and the world won't change around you is just wrong.
No, I completely agree. We've only got 1 minute left, so I'm going to ask you the hardest, most impossible question to answer, which is summed up by several of these questions. But how long is it going to take? When will we turn the economy back on? When will jobs start to be? When will people be hired for jobs again? How long are we thinking about? 6 months? Are we thinking longer?
You know, I do think sometime over the summer, I think there's going to be a ramp up slowly by New York will be the first one out of the gate, and it will be a regional ramp up. And we'll also be dealing with this very uneven world ramp up, global ramp up as well. But it's really contingent on we're buying time so that we can ramp up more safely and methodically. And that means accurate tests. That means all the things I've mentioned before to be able, and changes in protocol so people feel safe in coming back to work. We know from SARS and we know from what happened in China, people don't want to come back on public mass transit. They don't want to go to public places. There's a reluctance, and we need to put into place things that allow us to do that slowly, which means the second half of the year is a slow period in fits and starts of ramping up. And you really don't get going until 2021. You do need the stimulus in place for to help with the ramp up and the costs of those protocols and getting everyone, distributed masks, and companies need to be thinking about what the end game is and how they can ramp up safely. On the other side of it, we need the stimulus for 2021, and we'll see. It won't be a recession this whole year, but it's not going to be this V-shaped recovery. The second half will still be very uneven, even as we start to ramp up, and that's doing it methodically. And then you get into 2021, and you still, it takes a while to get back to the previous peak, and then you still aren't back to the previous lows on unemployment.
Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time. If we were in the council's offices in Chicago, I'd now ask the audience to give you a big round of applause. So I'm sure that they're all doing that from their bedrooms and their living rooms anyway. Well, Diane, thank you. That's great.
Thank you, Adam. And I think we can all go get our happy hour now, which we need in a
very And I should just tell everyone watching that you can see this recorded and will be broadcast again via the council's website, and I'm sure on other platforms like YouTube. And you can join in the discussion through their social media pages and look out for other great events that they're going to be having digitally. And I'm sure that before too long, they'll get back to having events in person. But thank you again, Diane, and everyone.
Thank you, Adam. I look forward to seeing you in person.
So do I. I look forward to seeing you. Thank you.